considerable number of videos, I have alluded to or outright mentioned a certain series called Paws of Stars, something I have been working on for a very long time at this point. Today, it is complete. As always, the link to it is in the description below and in the About section of my channel, but the majority of this video will be spent on something else. This particular book took slightly longer to release than the others have because I wanted to do more before the release than just edit the book. First, I wanted to go back to the first 6 books and edit them in the context of having written the conclusion, along with checking for any errors I missed the first time around. Second, I wanted to have all 7 covers complete so that I could say the series was truly done. And third, I needed to prepare to fulfill a promise. When I was just starting this YouTube channel, I promised myself and some of you that when Paws of Stars was complete, I would finally make a rundown of what it is, how it came to be, what choices were made, and why. And that day is finally here. I will start with an overview of the series' identity and history, along with some broad thoughts I had going in, but after that I will be going book by book, explaining the events that occur and choices that went into it with no regard for spoilers. If there are any books you haven't read yet and plan to, feel free to just skip over the chapters for those books. The conclusion will also be spoiler-free, in case you need to just skip there. With that said, let me explain. To get the basics down, Paws of Stars is a 7-book rewrite series combining and altering the plots of Power of 3 and Omen of the Stars. It has a special focus on character growth, fleshing out background characters to create a community, and making use of the plots to tell a story about particular themes that all of the characters could stand to learn something about. The idea for Paws of Stars arguably began when I first read Omen of the Stars in 2012, with The Forgotten Warrior and The Last Hope in particular striking me, as I finally realized what the goals of this effective 12-book arc had been, what rich material they had created accidentally, and where these arcs fell flat on paying off or making sense of the disparate character and story elements they had set up. I started considering in that moment what all of the characters could have been, could have done, could have become. And this was especially true with Hollyleaf, who had quickly become one of my favorite characters in any media by the end of this story. That said, I definitely didn't start writing or even outlining anything at that point. The series as it is now really took off 8 years later, in January of 2020. Thanks to some personal circumstances in my life, a new social circle with whom I could really talk about the analytical side of warriors, and a renewed passion for Omen of the Stars in particular, despite its many, many faults, I decided I wanted to see if I could show people exactly what I saw in this series, and why I got so excited about it. Of course, I also realized pretty quickly that I wouldn't be able to get the characters to the places I wanted if I didn't give them a strong foundation by rewriting the Power of 3 story in as well. That month, I laid out a document with all of the overarching points I wanted to hit for the characters, lore, or plot, including the themes I wanted the series to be based around following the new prophecy, which I then separated into what pieces I wanted to cover in each book, fleshing out each section with both original beats and important points from the canon material until I knew the general trajectory of the whole series. Over the next several months, I set about making a full outline of the series, detailing the chapters for all 7 books so that I could tell where I wanted the characters and plots to go from the beginning, and plan out different relationships, mentors, and friendships. When the outline was done, I gave each book a title, and finally, named the full series, Paws of Stars. I also, at this point, had to go through and hash out the official allegiances for all 7 books, plus the end of the arc, and expand upon or create some characters that would be needed to tell the story I wanted to. Even for those that did have characters, I created lists for all of them with their key relationships, personalities, and arcs across the series. I knew going into this that I explicitly wanted to create a story relatively close to the original. My primary goal from the beginning was showing why I loved Omen of the Stars, so I intended to take in almost all of the same building blocks, the goals, basic character profiles, plot points, and history from the original, but changing all of them just enough to make it something I would find most fulfilling and sensible. Because of this, and you might notice this as you're reading, the first book sticks relatively close to the source material of The Sight, Dark River, and Pieces of Eclipse, with the biggest changes being character personalities and relationships, such as some mentors being different, J-Paw's transition to being a medicine cat not being tied to his disability, and a few alterations from the canon that the new prophecy offered, such as Brackenfur being deputy instead of Brambleclaw. At this stage, I worked half as a writer and half as an editor, reordering and altering some canon, but leaving pieces that would still make sense in my narrative. As the books have gone on, though, the changes have built up, and in this last book I didn't pull from or even directly reference the source material at all. instead relying on the divergent world and cast that I have grown over time. Also, a note for those of you significantly more seasoned in the fanfiction world than I ever have been, the canon-compliant label is not a label I went into the series with, but retroactively it's the quickest way to describe what I was doing. So there may be some deviations from what you would usually expect in a canon-compliant fanfiction. Oh, and as an additional side note for anyone who remembers Tempest Rift, the WingClan story I wrote for the 20th Warriors anniversary with art by PETA and Lupa, video about it also linked in the description, that story exists in a separate universe from Paws of Stars, since I wanted to go off what was canon at the end of Power of Three, the canon arc. Paws of Stars is not canon to Tempest Rift. However, Tempest Rift may well be canon to Paws of Stars. Most of the familial and friend relationships, as well as the conflicts, are taking place over in WingClan, and you can imagine similar conflicts taking place all across the clans as we move through the arc. With all of that said, I believe it's time to begin the book-specific thoughts. We'll begin with the first book, Rising Tides, and for anyone who hasn't read it, don't worry because this is still a spoiler-free section. I've heard a lot of people who are reading or have read this book describe it as my rewrite of the site, which is half true? It's primarily the fusion of the character work in the site with the plot progression of Dark River. In other words, the book I think should have been the introduction to Power of Three from the beginning. However, some elements of Eclipse are also worked into this book for the sake of forwarding some characters' journeys. The true goal of Rising Tides was that, by the end, the world, cast, and especially main characters' values would be established, and that some smaller elements of lore could be introduced to be tugged on later. This book is mostly about who the three were before they learned about the prophecy, a topic I didn't think needed any more than one book. The main reason I decided to start here to begin with is because it is where each character is established, and, to an extent, it is where their character journeys over the whole arcs should be introduced. With the benefit of hindsight and having had time to meticulously plan out the whole arc before starting any of the writing, there were seeds of character and lore that I wanted to inject from the beginning. And sometimes that meant adding friendships, changing the order of plots, or subtly reinventing a character's identity. I put a lot of thought into who every character's mentor and friends would be, not just main characters, what their goals would be, and, of course, how I would let them change over the series. This opening book is just a taste of that. If you haven't read it and would like to, feel free to leave now, as I will be talking about the content of the book openly in just a few seconds. For the most part, I won't be giving a beat-by-beat summary of the books for the sake of time, and in many cases, I may go out of order to describe arcs by character or plot rather than sequentially, so if you do want to know how the stories go chronologically, feel free to read the books first. I wanted to begin the arc with the founders of the clans receiving the prophecy and deciding to tell, or perhaps warn, the rest of StarClan about it. They're a fun cast to write with, of course, but the main point was in showing generally how StarClan is reacting to the news, and how high up this prophecy would have to be for them to not really know who it came from or what it means. 3 kits will have the power of the stars, but what will that power be? Where did it come from? What will it be used for? Even who the kits are is unknown until one of them remembers that Squirrel Flight is about to have kits. The whole thing is mysterious to StarClan themselves in a way that it never was in the first or second arcs, an early indicator that something big is happening. You also get a short and nameless introduction to the cat who first named the Dark Forest, and understands how confusing and terrifying it can be. A brief teaser to the sort of lore that will become very important later. That said, most of the book is not about that. It's a fun little slice of life story with the biggest threats coming from a flood, cats trying to find their places in the world, and maybe just a little sprinkle of the Dark Forest. Brackenfur's placement as deputy I covered pretty extensively in his own video, linked in the description, and it is fairly self-explanatory within the story, so I'm going to start with our introduction to the 3 protagonists. For the most part, they are the same characters you would summarize them to be from Power of Three, with J-Paw as a snide and pessimistic Tom who doesn't take well to pity and wants to prove himself as valuable on his own merits, Hollypaw as a stuck-up and unflinchingly stubborn she-cat who always tries her best to do the right thing and has a sizable ambition prompting her to exceed expectations, and Lionpaw is a temperamental and sometimes emotional Tom who doesn't think much about the future and never has any real need to, considering how well he gets by on instinct alone. They do love each other and do many things together, but they also butt heads a lot, especially at the beginning, and their different paths and goals lead them further and further apart before the end of the story. In particular, Hollypaw and Jaypaw are caught up in the medicine cat and warrior apprentice jobs that they chose, neither of them being skilled in or happy with their professions. Hollypaw eventually realizes, and importantly, chooses, to stop being a medicine cat apprentice, and Jaypaw is in many ways forced by Leafpool and Spotted Leaf and StarClan to make the opposite choice, after he displays the level of herb knowledge and power he has. This is a contentious decision, so I would like to explain my rationale. Many people take the sloppy story of Jaypaw's transition to a medicine cat in canon and decide that the better alternative would be leaving him as a warrior, the path he has chosen, and helping him to work around his disability. This is definitely a valid approach, and there are ways it can be done well, but I had a few different reasons for favoring his path as a medicine cat. First, as I said earlier, my goal was to make the series with as many of the original building blocks as possible, so if I could find a way to make the original story work, that's what I was going to do. More importantly, though, Jayfeather is actually one of the most talented, innovative, and passionate medicine cats in all of clan history, and I wanted him to be able to learn about that passion he does have and choose being a medicine cat for himself in time. I chose to move Cinderpaw's injury into this book instead of Eclipse for that reason, so Jaypaw could get a much earlier understanding of his own talent in and passion for the field of medicine. This is also a good time to mention Jaypaw's power. To avoid powers that couldn't be described or predicted, as I talked about in the powers video, which is also linked in the description, I wanted to nail down for myself what their powers were. And for Jaypaw, he has the ability to hear the thoughts of cats around him, which sometimes includes dreams or memories if that is what they are experiencing. This combined with his intelligence means he has developed a great intuition and can often guess what a cat is feeling based on the tone of their thoughts. But he's not an empath in the way that Yellowfang was in her very bad Super Edition. Also, as a side note, Cinderpaw is not Cinderpelt because that was stupid in so many ways, and yet again, I'm just linking to the video where I talked about that in particular because it's a whole can of worms on its own. Why didn't I have him choose to be a medicine cat from the start then? Well, everyone's primary reasoning in my story for why Jaypaw should be a medicine cat is that he has a natural ability to remember herbs, a natural connection to StarClan, and a natural power that lends itself to medicine cat business anyway. It's all based on intrinsic factors in him that tie to destiny. And without overstepping the spoiler boundaries of this book, destiny was a huge theme I wanted to ingrain in the arc, and it was especially important that Jayfeather learned early on to believe in and, to an extent, trust in destiny. Of course, this choice meant that Hollyleaf needed a new warrior mentor, and I went with Thornclaw over Brightheart. Several of my reasons for picking him specifically were covered in my very old Thornclaw video, but I chose not to use Brightheart because she's a rather introverted but compassionate and put-together she-cat. She would be able to keep up with Hollypaw, but she would also be likely to provide too much room for development, and Hollyleaf as a warrior still needed to start off as somewhat unstable. Thornclaw shares some aspects of his mindset with Hollyleaf, which made them a seemingly perfect pair while simultaneously pushing Hollyleaf further into tendencies that would hurt her in the long run. And naturally, with this change, I decided to fulfill the promise that Firestar made in the original and actually give Brightheart one of the next kits, Icepaw, who she is a much better fit for anyway. Through all of this, Lionpaw is having a secret friendship, but not romance, with Heatherpaw and turning to Tigerstar, who justifies all of his behaviors. This was one of the first huge areas I changed, because Tigerstar is our introduction into the Dark Forest and their methods, especially as they may have changed since the New Prophecy. I decided to keep the lore from the New Prophecy that cats simply cannot, and never do, find each other here. Tigerstar meets Lionpaw alone, until one day when, somehow, and seemingly to Tigerstar's own shock, they meet Hawkfrost, and he is able to start training with them as well. Wonder what that's about. Anyway, I also changed the Dark Forest's approach. In canon, Tigerstar, in the few scenes we saw him or heard him talked about, patronized or berated Lionpaw about friendships and Heatherpaw in almost exactly the same ways Hollypaw was doing, and passed over the prophecy as being a work of fiction in order to credit his own brutal training as the only reason Lionpaw was capable. Sometimes he would even attack Lionpaw or Lionblaze angrily just because he's Tigerstar, I guess. In my version, Tigerstar offers Lionpaw the words and security in his choices that he needs to push back against his sister, and almost offers Lionpaw more an emotional stability away from his snide siblings and mentor in Ashfur than he offers in battle training. The goal of the Dark Forest here, and Tigerstar specifically, is building loyalty, not the next brutal leader of ThunderClan. Later in this book, we also get one more addition that I'll mention here and explain later. Daisy's second litter is born, with Toadkit and Rosekit like in canon, along with a newcomer, Buzzardkit. There's a few reasons I decided to add her that I'll explain in the next book, but the first is because there is a kit with no gender, family, or appearance named Buzzardkit that is mentioned once in WindClan in the site. This Buzzardkit is paying tribute to that one. Now that I have covered most of the big changes at least, I feel ready to move on to the second book. Spoilers incoming there, so if you have only read Rising Tides and want to see the rest of the series, stop here. This is the Soul book, in that it's the book where all of his content from Eclipse and Long Shadows takes place. I would argue it's even more a Soul book than either of those were, because the big war whose ending he predicted and that started the tension he preyed on with Blackstar was, in this story, his own doing. I went over many of my biggest problems with Soul in his dedicated video, which, as with the others, I have linked in the description, but by far the biggest change I wanted to make with him is that he is in charge of the events of the story, and he never lets go of that control. Very late into this book, when the problem is already solved, the reader can discover that Soul had actually come to One Star and Leopard Star already, before he went to ThunderClan to see Firestar or ShadowClan to see Blackstar. He had learned of and preyed on the insecurities in WindClan and RiverClan's leaders in order to prompt them to start a war, the tension from which he would use to further take control of the lake and its leaders. In ThunderClan, he was shot down because Firestar doesn't have any current insecurities, but once he had his clash with One Star, his old friend, he might have been more susceptible. However, he did discover some of the clan's most powerful magic there, in the Three, and he managed to tie them to him with trust and necessity, even as he left them to see Blackstar by pretending to be captured instead, and telling his loyal pawns that he would come back for them. This gives him a much, much stronger hold on all the characters in the story, and this is before he flat out gets ShadowClan to leave the lake, not just stop feeding the children. I also just really love his interactions with Hollyleaf in particular, who is in this book becoming absolutely desperate to find her power once her brothers both have theirs. But that is a thread I will dig more into when I cover the next book. Soul aside, it is arguably Lionblaze who is having the strongest character arc, as, during the war, he discovers his power, not being able to get hurt. As I mentioned in the Rising Tide section, I wanted to nail in the rules of the Three's powers early, and for Lionblaze, his skin cannot be pierced by any thorn, tooth, or claw. He doesn't have any immense strength or fury-motivated power-ups, but he does have anger issues and a body of sheer might and muscle that he can whack around without fear of it ever getting hurt, which still leads to cats being hurt by him without Lionblaze necessarily intending to hurt them. Tigerstar is still training him, seemingly with more intention, and for some reason the Dark Forest seems to be getting more populated as they grow, with characters like Mapleshade and Brokenstar appearing to be introduced to Lionblaze. Interesting to note here is that when Lionblaze brings up Soul, Tigerstar immediately tells Lionblaze to get him out of the territories, recognizing him as a threat and wanting the Tom gone as soon as possible, even when all he has done yet, from Lionblaze's perspective, is be captured by ShadowClan and offered to train the Three. Why is this? Well, it's actually pretty simple. Tigerstar's ultimate goal is, and always has been, ruling the clans. Soul's goal is to destroy them, and Tigerstar can't take over something that has been lost. At the end of the story, though, Lionblaze is ready to step back from his training entirely, because he recognizes that he needs to grow in areas other than strength. And Tigerstar... let's just say he doesn't take well to it. Lionblaze could never trust Tigerstar and never will again. But now that he's headed in the right direction, he still has a lot of growing to do. Jayfeather and Hollyleaf are both having their own arcs in this book too, of course. Both of them fall for Soul so quickly, in part because they are searching for their destinies, and no one is able to tell them what they are or how to fulfill them. But Jayfeather also has other things to occupy his time, namely a huge bout of Greencough sweeping through his clan. I knew going into this that if I was going to include this plot point, I wanted it to actually take some life, and I especially wanted it to have an effect on the plot or characters overall. Firestar does lose a life here, as he did in the original, but this is also where both Mousewhisker and Buzzardkit die, showing just how severe this sickness was, along with making Buzzardkit's siblings each understand, very early, how dangerous life can be. Their sister's death came almost right after the war started in their own camp, and both Toadkit and Rosekit internalize these early events, which will put them in different directions with different mindsets when they get older. They don't get to be close siblings forever, or close with their mother forever in the way they were before this, just because their family is so mangled in emotions. All of them do care for each other and still spend time together at times, but they also end up needing different types of emotional support from other types of relationships. But of course, that will come up more in a later book. As for Mouse Whisker, his death might seem like a waste or just a way to double down on Daisy's pain, but I promise it actually serves a very important purpose, and Mouse Whisker's story is not done. I'll come back to this in a later book, but I swear I didn't do this thoughtlessly. The sickness also gives a chance for Jayfeather to go into Poppy Frost's dream and force her back from dying. A powerful ability combined with his effective persuasion that allowed the she-cat to live. And learn about his power as well. Yes, Poppy Frost knows about his power now and isn't about to forget it, or that she owes her life to Jayfeather. Friendships are really valuable to a writer since they allow you to play characters off each other and force them to explain their situations and feelings in revealing ways. So this was definitely a relationship I wanted to pull on. This book also starts off a friendship with Tawny Pelt's kits, both with our three protagonists and with Foxpaw, who was directed to show them around camp. It's an unimportant side note for now, but like with many things, this will come back later. Finally, I'd like to cover Hollyleaf, because her arc, while not yet at its peak, is showing signs of tension here. She really wants to find her power and be a mentor, both steps on the different paths she has identified as helping her to be important, being a hero in a prophecy, or becoming deputy, then leader. Neither of these things have happened yet, which makes her especially desperate to get the knowledge Soul has, and especially angry when it turns out he was using her. However, she also gets a conversation with StarClan themselves after they help to return Blackstar's faith, by explaining that they are still his family and friends, and not just a faceless body of ancestors, instead of by saying, "We exist, believe in us," as if that was ever in question. Hollyleaf asks about the prophecy, and about herself, but even they don't have the answers. Whatever the three are meant to fight hasn't been revealed, and they don't know what her power could be either, only that she should use it wisely. Even then, they try to reassure her that she has great strength and conviction without a prophecy. All she needs is experience, which will come with time. But time may be harder than it sounds to get. It's about time for us to move on to the third book. If you haven't read it, and would like to before you hear spoilers, feel free to hop off now. As with the first book's prologue, this one contains a nameless introduction to another important and effectively original Dark Forest character. This time, it's the very first cat who went to the Dark Forest rather than StarClan. And later in this book, we learn it is Ebony Star. I've talked about both her and Fawnskip, the cat from the first book's prologue, in a video before, which, as with the others, I will link in the description. But there's a reason Ebony Star is introduced in this specific book. Before we get to that, though, let's start with the big thing, the fire scene. For this story, though, the fire scene isn't just important because of what's in it. It had plenty of build-up and a lot of consequences. The scene itself is far from the only important piece of the book. Lionblaze is feeling guilty about his anger issues, especially in regards to Heathertail, noticing his connection to Tigerstar. Hollyleaf has been getting downtrodden about not having an apprentice and avoiding the topic when her best friend Cinderheart brings it up, and Jayfeather and the other medicine cats have been having difficulty connecting to StarClan even at the Moonpool. And when they finally get in, Yellowfang tells him that they've been trying to reach out too from the other side, but have been unable to get through. This is another piece of lore I decided to alter. Ancestors have a certain amount of energy that they can spend on fantastic deeds connecting the worlds of the dead and the living. This can be simpler things like covering the moon with clouds, or much more complicated and taxing things like coming down physically. There are some spots like the Moonstone, Moonpool, and Cave of Pointed Stones that already have energy infused in them and are easy connection spots to ancestors in the area. But even connecting to those in the first place will take some level of energy. I made this choice for a few reasons, some of which I can only get to in a future book section, but to start, I wanted StarClan to be, in some ways, limited. No matter how big you ultimately make the Dark Forest, or how weak the Three's powers are, if you have thousands of all-powerful and all-knowing StarClan cats on your side, you win. Period. There is no tension. I wanted strings I could later tug on to make their final conflict suspenseful, and to make the villains not seem like absolute mouse brains for attempting it. Anyway, fire scene. There were 3 big changes I wanted to make here. First, I wanted the adopting part to not be what frames Squirrelflight in a negative light, because that does not look good for anyone. Instead, the 3 protagonists are mostly mad at her for lying their whole lives, and even now, refusing to say who their parents are despite knowing. Second, I wanted to make Ashfur significantly more menacing, both so he would be more threatening in this book and so he could better motivate the protagonists to act. Combining both of those, Ashfur decides to tell the clans about the three's parentage not on a whim, but because it seems like an even better punishment for Squirrel Flight than her kits dying. Now those kits and all of the clans will hate her, and maybe she would even be exiled. Her life will be ruined. Finally, I wanted the scene and aftermath to be from Lineblaze and Hollyleaf's points of view rather than Jayfeather's. Aside from Jayfeather immediately being able to tell how Squirrel Flight feels, which robs us of mystery, Lineblaze's relationship to Tigerstar has been fueling a lot of his arc for the last couple of books, and Hollyleaf's identity has been tied to somehow being superior for almost her whole life, whether that was because she was the daughter of two other noble heroes, or because she was kin of Firestar's kin who had the power of the stars, in some way. Both of those ideas are torn down if she isn't Squirrel Flight and Brambleclaw's daughter by blood. The clans already look down on Daisy's kits, Brooke, Millie, and half-clan cats because of their origins, and now those criticisms might be extended to her as well. Who knows where she came from now? That brings up another difference. In canon, for drama purposes, they had everyone upset about the revelations in the fire scene equally, and because Hollyleaf's values and status as the one left out hadn't even been set up at this point, she fell right in with her brothers. Here, though, Hollyleaf doesn't want this to get out because she's worried about their reputation, but there's also an element of relief, because now she knows all the work she's been putting in to find her power was fruitless from the beginning. Neither she nor her brothers ever had them. They were confused. None of them were ever in the prophecy. Of course, we know that isn't the case, and her brothers are pretty certain about it too. Jayfeather and Lineblaze each end up using their powers to try and convince Ashfur not to tell the clans about them. And Ashfur actually takes these opportunities to learn about their abilities and declare that he will share these as well, because they are, as he calls them, freaks. This even gets us to the point where, by the time he confronts Hollyleaf, he is completely cocky about knowing exactly who she is and what she will do. She shocks him by being totally calm and convinced of his malice, giving up on convincing him and, as you can guess, murdering him instead. After this point, Dovepaw and Ivypaw are eventually apprenticed to Millie and Lineblaze respectively. Lineblaze because he wouldn't be a great mentor as he focused on Dovepaw and didn't have great technique to begin with, but also because he could eventually connect with Ivypaw over their shared experiences in the Dark Forest. And Millie because I wanted her to have an apprentice at some point, her open mind and higher compassion compared to most clan-raised warriors working well for Dovepaw, and because she too would eventually fall into some neglect of her apprentice later on that would leave Dovepaw to fall back more on the developing relationship she does have. Of course, this is also when Dovepaw's power is discovered. The three do in fact tell Firestar, and Hollyleaf is left to finally realize she was just left out of the prophecy. She starts drawing away from her friends, closing off her heart as she hasn't been chosen as a mentor at all, and now thinks she doesn't deserve it, and finally is confronted with two villains who want to connect with her. First is Soul, who subtextually reveals that he saw her kill Ashfur, and that he sees a lot of himself in her, with how she wields her control to shape the world in the way she wants, without any supernatural abilities. Second is Ebony Star, the creator of the Dark Forest, who thinks that she should consider joining them, considering the Dark Forest itself is not black and white. After all, Ashfur was allowed into StarClan, and Ebony Star only went to the Dark Forest because she couldn't stand to share an afterlife with one of her enemies. Hollyleaf's emotional spiral finally climaxes in the scenes you are familiar with. The Gathering, trying to kill Leafpool and running away into the tunnels. But here, they are followed by a scene from Hollyleaf's perspective where, out of a hazy state, she appears in the Dark Forest and speaks with Fawnskip, who thinks she is coming to join them and guesses at why. I can't explain at this point why this happened, because it relies on a fair bit of lore I haven't yet introduced, but safe to say this will be important moving forward. And speaking of, it's time to move to the next book. If you want to avoid spoilers for Founder's Pact, hop off here. Okay, so this is where the Omen of the Stars half-ish begins, and where the divergences become even more noticeable. I've already had to skip plenty of important details in the previous summaries, but for these books, I'm really just going to have to discuss the essential beats, or ones I have heard discussed or gotten questions about already. First off, let's nail down Dovepaw's power. She can hear and send things from far distances, but that doesn't extend to sight. Pretty simple and direct, but it also ties into her personality and the way her chapters are structured. Dovepaw is, in some ways, a camera by choice, as she often zones out to focus in on random happenings with cats around the clans, rather than focusing on the cats around her or her own performance. Often these moments aren't even important to the story in any way. It's just who Dovepaw is to look for and think about them, which helps to establish her identity as someone who fundamentally doesn't understand placing borders between the clans or choosing who her friends can be. This was also a trend I tried to establish early with a 3-clan journey to get prey for an ailing leopard star. A much quicker version of the beaver journey with some dynamics from the outcast journey thrown in as well to show how Breezepelt and Crowfeather are doing with line plays since the revelations in the last moon. It is at this time where Dovepaw and the newly named Tigerheart's friendship begins as well. 2 cats who both already desired friendships across borders, finding solace in a cat who shares their views. They are strictly friends at this point, though, and it will take a long time before either of them thinks to make it romantic. A choice I made both because I didn't want a warrior dating an apprentice problem, and because Tigerheart will make a mistake later on that I would rather him do to a friend rather than his girlfriend before he figures out how to make it right. That and, well, maybe Dovepaw is just a little bit demisexual as a treat. Also in this book, we get the first glimpse of how Jayfeather and Lionblaze are reacting to Hollyleaf's death. Lionblaze is extremely touchy in defending her memory. Jayfeather is guarded and avoiding the subject of her when he isn't blaming her openly for her fate, and theirs, and both are pretty closed off to Dovepaw, the newest member of their trio. However, by the end of the book, Dovepaw, alone as she has been and closed off from her sister and mentor, gets the brothers to open up and for the 3 of them to try really becoming friends, since they will have to work together and, in many ways, they're all each other has. Ivypaw also joins the Dark Forest in this book with motivations similar to her ones in canon, and she also really befriends Blossompaw without any bullying before the, jealousy stuff starts. Briarpaw's injury and Longtail's death comes near the end of this book, and the fallout from it, while it isn't resolved here, prompts some resentment in Blossompaw and gets Hawkfrost to finally accept Ivypaw's request in inviting her to the Dark Forest, with her own dedicated mentor, Mapleshade. I should mention here that I have each Dark Forest cat with a single living trainee, because, with the way Ebony Star was designing this, the primary goal was forging a personal bond so that the trainees could be made more loyal to their dream home. This is also why training groups begin to be introduced here, so that trainees can become acclimated to more than the one cat they train with. Well, there is one other reason why it's advantageous to the Dark Forest, but that's lore-related and isn't something we learn here, so I'll leave that for another time. The last huge thing I definitely need to cover for this book is the, Jayfeather time travel stuff. As I mentioned early in this video, my goal was using as many of the original building blocks as possible, in different ways, to make them more cohesive and push towards a core theme, character arc, and/or plot progression. This was no different, but the ultimate meaning of this section won't become apparent for a couple of books. For the moment, though, Jayfeather is called into the past through entering Fallen Leaves' memories of almost the exact same event with Jayswing as he was entering the tunnels for the first time. And, once Jayfeather experiences Jayswing's death, he goes out to meet the Ancients, none of whom he knows anything about because he is not one of them. However, he does recognize his own name, his sister's name, Dove's Feather, and one of the kits' names, Lion's Roar, as being similar to the 3 back home. The big important thing here, though, is Halfmoon, whose very presence sends him into a spiral of overlapping memories that he cross-references with Brook's story of the founding of the tribe in order to realize that Halfmoon will be the first Stone Teller, and is the one who must guide the Ancients to the mountains. I made sure that the lake was sizably more dangerous in this period in all the ways the mountain would not be to make the choice more reasonable, and gave Halfmoon as much agency over the tribe's future as was possible. I was especially interested in writing the moments after Halfmoon is told that Jayswing is actually Jayfeather, a complete stranger to her. She quickly becomes more closed off and bound only to fulfill the destiny Jayfeather has told her about. Shutting out Jayfeather himself is a way to avoid the pain of thinking about the cat who he currently looks like. Jayfeather is able to recognize himself in this, as this is exactly the way he has thrown himself into the prophecy to forget about Hollyleaf's death and the harm she did. And he finishes by feeling a modicum of comfort that both of them are resigned to their destinies, and at least he's not alone. He also tells her about the powers and the prophecy that allowed him to be here when she asks, along with mentioning the name similarities to and the other powers of the other members of the 3 back home. I'm sure that's not important though, so I feel ready to move on to the next book. If you want to avoid any fading light spoilers, stop here. Oh boy, it's getting harder by the minute to choose which points are important enough to talk about. Well, let's get some of the small stuff out of the way first. Poppy Frost, now with Berrynose's kits, has the battle scene with Jayfeather, Honeyfern, Broken Star, and Breezepelt at the Moonpool. But Poppy Frost participates in the fight. Yellowfang warns them afterwards that the fact Broken Star was able to come down means the Dark Forest is getting stronger. And Poppy Frost and Jayfeather actually report what happened to Firestar, but one star is unwilling to hear them out when they try to tell him about it. The Dark Forest is expanding and involving many more training groups, which includes Foxleap with Tigerheart, Otterheart and Rainstorm from RiverClan, and Mousewhisker and Minnowtail, who have actually been training with Snowtuft and Silverhawk since even before Lionpaw started training there. I have a separate video about that particular story if you have deeper interest. Also, Briarlight, with support from not just Jayfeather but Toadstep as well, finds value in herself enough to stand up to her mother, and because she specifically wants to have something to do instead of just exercises to feel like her days have meaning, Jayfeather makes her the official caretaker to the Medicine Den. She'll also be allowed to sleep in the Warrior's Den once a modified nest is created. Okay, bigger stuff now. First, Ivypaw is manipulated into creating the ShadowClan-ThunderClan war as a means of ultimately bringing peace, and, as in canon, Russetfur and one of Firestar's lives are taken. Unlike in canon, though, Brackenfur and Oakfur also end up killing each other, and Brightheart is, shakily at first, made deputy. She's not someone who feels confident in the position and didn't go out seeking it. Honestly, she was a bit of a loner thanks to an underlying belief that her clanmates can't value or trust her as much as other cats, but this is a position I wanted her to eventually take and grow in. Definitely go and watch my Brightheart video, which, sounding like a broken record, is in the description if you want to know more about that. One key is that, despite Brightheart being deputy, Cloudtail still steps in to defend her or even give orders beside her a lot, which is a leftover piece of their imbalanced relationship which will definitely be addressed in the future. Also, the three find out Ivypaw is training in the Dark Forest, and, at first, unwillingly, get her to send information back to them by having Ivypaw think about it and Jayfeather read her mind, just in case they are listening. Ivypaw isn't too happy about it, but with some extra bad experiences and direct confirmation from the leaders, Tigerstar and Ebony Star, that their ultimate goal is taking over the clans, she feels lost and sent back to try and rekindle relationships elsewhere. This leads to one of my favorite scenes, where the newly named Dovewing confesses her own power as a measure of trust and explains that she might not have earned her name, and Ivypool tells her the power has always been her own, and it's been her choice how to use it. She deserves what she has. This relationship in general is something I also covered much more extensively in its own video in the description, and by this point you might notice just how much of my YouTube channel has been dancing around discussing Paws of Stars topics as I thought of them. It's not the only thing I think about, but it sure has occupied a lot of my mind space over the last 3.5 years. Ivypool also begins actively seeking out stories of cats in the Dark Forest, looking for reasons they are aligned with them, and cats who might be willing to help the Three's side instead, including Fawnskip, Ivypool's new spy partner. Lineblaze is doing fairly well too, figuring out a way to get along better with and apologize to his apprentice, and also deciding to confess his power to Cinderheart in the middle of her confessing her love for him. It's awkward, it's sweet, there's no drama, and they become mates. There is no need to invent conflict between these two, they have plenty more going on to worry about. Oh, also, Brambleclaw gets a serving of criticism for how he has been silently and occasionally openly cruel to Squirrelflight since their breakup, causing him to begin a re-evaluation that will continue later. In Jayfeather's part of the world, Flametail dies. Because I exiled Rock from the entire story, Jayfeather is the only one in the lake with him at the time, and it is Jayfeather himself who chooses to let go of Flametail rather than continuing trying to save him, which leaves him with a little bit of guilt for Dawnpelt to truly stand up against as she tries to find a direction for her anger. By the way, this behavior and the revealing at the gathering thing is very much a parallel for Hollyleaf, like Tigerheart was a parallel for Lionblaze, and in a lesser way, Flametail for Jayfeather. But this will be directly pointed out by Dawnpelt herself later. Also, after one last message, StarClan is flat out gone. Broken Star closes off the border between StarClan and the Dark Forest, and the Dark Forest has control of the Moonpool now too. StarClan has no more way to contact the living world at all, which were stakes I felt were just about necessary moving towards the final battle. If the three are going to be the tipping point, they need to be the only ones with the power of the stars in their paws, and when the time comes, they will need to use it. Finally, we definitely need to talk about Hollyleaf's return. She was able to come back at all because she never died. Fawnskip pulled her into a dream as she lay unconscious, something she actually wouldn't have been able to do if Hollyleaf really was dead, since all Dark Forest cats first appear on their own. Hollyleaf returns to her clan with some shame and hesitance, mostly staying because of Lionblaze's desperation and the clan's immediate threat by Sol and his manipulated army from WindClan attacking through the tunnels. But after another pointed conversation with the Tom who sometimes seemed to know her better than she knew herself, she decided to truly commit to being better and facing her mistakes, starting with giving Sol exactly one chance to run away from the clans and never return, and promptly going back to the clan and turning down the offer of being a hero to instead contradict her father's lie and confess fully to Ashfur's murder, accepting whatever punishment would come in the process. This is probably the point where I can link to Hollyleaf's own video in the description, but this is a case where I consider this move flat out necessary to continue her story. If she's working towards betterment and redemption among the cats she hurt now, she can't begin on a foundation of lies. That said, it's now time to move on to the 6th book, where all of this ramps up in Uproar. If you haven't read it yet and would like to, stop now. This is the book that could most be said to be added in comparison to the others. When I was working on my outline, it was the one I ended up adding in to give some breathing room. There were a number of personal conflicts to resolve before the final battle arrived, several components to set up on both sides of the army, and a couple of lore beats I needed to cover in order to tie in the theming of the whole arc. In the end, I decided I would need a 7th book to fit it in, and this is where that book landed. It starts off with Sindana the Clan Cats greeting Halfmoon, or Stoneteller rather, and sending her with a message for the 3 in the hope she can reach them when they can't. But before we get on to all of that, let's cover the little things for this book. First of all, Hazeltail and Icecloud and Toadstep and Briarlight are made explicitly official mates from their mouths as of this book, even though the subtext was there before. I chose these relationships because I knew I would be removing one, Blossomfall with Thornclaw, and with the personalities I gave each of these characters, I thought the pairings would work well. They get along with each other and each have ways to forward their partner's growth or help cover their weaknesses and boost their strengths. Also, I definitely wanted an explicit gay couple that wasn't in the Dark Forest, and Briarlight deserves to get a mate even though she can't physically have kits. Deathwing also deals with a very forward Bumblestripe in this book for the most part, and learns from Cinderheart what real love should feel like so she can let him down before she makes up with Tigerheart, who learned not to always support Dawn Pelt if she's doing something he doesn't really believe in. Brightheart gets to confront Cloudtail about how important independence is in proving herself in the position of deputy, and they get to work on a much more balanced and positive relationship for the future. And even Squirrelflight, Leafpool, and Brambleclaw get a chance to hash out all that went on between them and part on polite terms, content with being part of the same family even if none of them will get together with their mates again. Ivypool and Fawnskip are also doing some more active recruitment of cats for their counter-army, though their spying doesn't go perfectly, as Ebony Star seems to cut them off by recruiting the rest of their potential army herself, letting all of the Dark Forest come together in preparation for their final battle. I wasn't about to let one of the main villains who's intended to be extremely intelligent let Ivypool and Fawnskip, who she barely trusted anyway, keep going off on their own to recruit an equal-sized army on their own. But I do have the exact names and appearances of every Dark Forest cat along with their backstories, even if they were never revealed in the story. This is probably a good moment to point out that both the moral ambiguity of the Dark Forest and the hierarchy they're currently forming become central forces here. It is revealed, in pieces, that all it takes to go to the Dark Forest is to want to or think you should go to the Dark Forest. If you don't want or don't think you deserve StarClan for any reason, you won't end up there. This was my way of reconciling the cats who were and weren't sent to the Dark Forest in canon, and the frankly angering form of justice they've stuck to, all of which I calmly discussed in the Redemption and Forgiveness video, which, again, is linked in the description. There's no ultimate source of judgment to decide the goodness or badness of cats. The Dark Forest was created by a cat who didn't want StarClan and hated the idea of belonging with them, and so each cat that joined them followed a similar pattern. Through all of this, in the living world, Hollyleaf is trying to find a way to redeem herself in the clans, accepting both the tactile punishments Firestar gives her, and Brambleclaw for lying, and the emotional punishments of having cats she's really close to, like Hazeltail and Thornclaw, not want to speak with her anymore. Thornclaw in particular is mad at both her and his old friend Ashfur for not being the cats he thought they were, and for both denying his help when he offered it in their darkest moments. And Hazeltail is seemingly upset for her mentor Dustpelt's sake, but also definitely doesn't like how Hollyleaf closed herself off and let the clans believe she was dead for so long. Lionblaze wants to forget she ever did anything wrong, and Jayfeather still blames her for leaving them to deal with her mess, which gets them to bicker with each other almost as much as with Hollyleaf herself. Even with cats who are willing to speak with her, it will take time for the trust and openness of their relationships to return. And Hollyleaf knows it can't just go back to the exact way it was before. She has to change and prove her change too, after all. This is something she and Ivypool actually bond over, as the latter finally decides to confess to murdering Antpelt as a way of gaining favor with the Dark Forest elites. It does help each of them to have a friend they can talk to who knows about but is outside of the three as well, considering the different flavors of resentment it built up in each of them. Reconciling with the three in particular, though, actually leads Hollyleaf to help them in training, something she had been practicing when she was still looking for her own power. Through this, we learn that the three have abilities to stretch their powers with great amounts of focus and effort. Lionblaze can make his fur sharp like prickles so it hurts other cats to touch, Dovewing can see glimpses of the places she hears and scents, and Jayfeather can share his own thoughts as well as hearing others, which allows the five protagonists to have conversations entirely in the realms of their minds, without any Dark Forest cats being able to hear. Jayfeather was easily the most adverse to these methods, though, because he's been caught up in a frustrating arc of his own. Half Moon delivered the message from StarClan to him early in the book, that the end of the stars draws near, and three must become four to battle the darkness that lasts forever. This prompts all of the three to seek out who they think are the fourth cats in the prophecy, and all three cats are turned down. But while Half Moon was there, she also mentioned something else, that she was the one who created the three. This is the reason I chose to keep Jayfeather's time travel as a plot element. Being the effective founder of both the tribe and the clans, Half Moon was able to use most of StarClan's energy to give the powers described to her by Jayfeather to the cats he mentioned as being the three in his time. A bootstrap paradox created the three. No one chose them. They weren't designed to fight the Dark Forest. In fact, without their powers being created, the Dark Forest wouldn't have been able to grow as strong, as we learn that Lionblaze inadvertently broke the barriers between the Dark Forest residents while training there. They created their own enemy, and have no guarantee of stopping it. For Jayfeather, who has been dutifully following his destiny since he was an apprentice, this is a gut punch, and it takes a long time for the others to help him come out of his funk by citing the agency he's had in developing his skills and saving all of the cats he has helped as a medicine cat. He can choose to help the clans now, too. As for the final prophecy itself, it turns out the solution was that there wasn't a fourth cat at all. StarClan was trying to remind them that they needed to become part of the 4 clans, involving every cat around the lake if they were going to defeat the Dark Forest. This is a systematic problem that 3 cats wouldn't ever be able to fix on their own. This leads to the preparation for the final battle, where all 4 leaders agree to work together and, perhaps, to hear out the trainees' concerns that led them astray when the battle is over. Each of them also contributes an idea as to how the final battle should go. Since they have too many cats to congregate in a single area, Misty Star suggests that they at least send a warrior to each of the other clans so that every camp can be protected by skills from each clan. Firestar suggests that they put any cats who need defending into the medicine den, nursery, and/or elder's den so that the herbs can be protected and medicine cats can heal during the battle. Blackstar proposes that they meet to train the following day so that warriors from each clan can learn some of the skills from the others, and One Star suggests that messengers should be chosen to carry news and stay out of the battle. With the plan created, they ready themselves for the fight of their lives. If you haven't read the last book that came out today, and don't want spoilers for it, you shouldn't feel any shame in hopping off now and coming back later. And so here we come to the big one. A lot of this book was genuinely emotional for me to write because so many of the plot, character, lore, and theming pieces were among the first parts I conceived for the series, and were the main ideas that I built the arc around. All of the relationships from main character ones like Ivypool and Blossomfall and Hollyleaf and Thornclaw to background relationships like Poppyfrost and Berrynose and Tigerheart and Dawnpelt find their conclusions, and all sorts of character arcs are completed across the clans. In the same way that the new prophecy was, at least intended to be about unity, Paws of Stars, and especially this book, are themed around choice and change, including, of course, the choices that inspire change. All of our protagonists have to change. Learning to change themselves, accepting the change in others, or fighting for the change in the clans. And all of this is made possible by their individual and group choices. Destiny has also been a big theme of the arc, but in a faulty sense. It is what all 5 of our protagonists, and even many of the Dark Forest trainees, are following to some degree and in different ways. Whether they're following the assumed will of StarClan or the Dark Forest leaders, whatever great force makes the prophecies or the deemed inevitable triumph of the Place of No Stars, many of the characters place their trust in and take comfort in following a destiny rather than making choices on their own. However, these destinies all turn out to be either false or faulty, as their creators were no more knowledgeable than they were and, in some cases, were actively taking advantage of their wishes. The Dark Forest versus StarClan conflict was manufactured from the start. They're two pieces of the same afterlife, sharing the same power source, and the only thing that ties the Dark Forest residents together is that they didn't feel like they belonged in StarClan for whatever reason. This is why I spent so much time fleshing out the Dark Forest residents and making up a lot of them, along with deciding who the trainees each were and what their relationships were like. I needed you to be able to care about cats on each side of this battle, and understand why the clans were effectively destroying themselves in the name of change, or in the Elite's case, truly in the name of taking over and gaining a grasp over the clan's systems and code that kept them held back in life. Though of course, I also needed the Dark Forest to be larger, for the logical reason of needing a big enough force to make an army. That's also why StarClan had to be completely blocked off during this battle, because when thousands of good warriors enter the fight, they win no matter what other factors are at play. Even outside of the Dark Forest, though, the living clans needed to be filled with cats who you could see as loving members of a large community. Cats you could love and care about on their own, or based on their interactions with each other. Both sides needed to be sympathetic, and more than anything, the clans needed to be worth saving for this battle to resonate. That's why I spent so much time on background cats and relationships, why I made sure all of our cats had friends, family, and/or budding romances that they didn't want to let go of, and that hopefully even a reader could grow to care for. I also utilized the moving of living cats around the different clans, and the Dark Forest choice to send trainees to various different clans to make sure that we got to see the battle from each clan's camp, to make it feel more unified and give more chances for different characters to shine. For this reason, I was able to show nearly every death and every death reaction on the page, rather than just saying they happened afterwards. Every cat in the clans has friends or family who care about them, and every death motivates cats around them to do something. Notably, this was also part of Ebony Star's plan. By dividing her army in the way she did, and knowing that her own warriors could be sent back if they died or got too injured, while cats aligned with StarClan could not, she intended to let some of her own cats die as a way of angering the rest of the trainees and motivating them to be more ruthless with the remaining cats. And every living cat killed motivates the clan's army to be more brutal and careless with the living cats on the Dark Forest side. She also split Ivypool and Vonskip from the cats they had recruited, so that they would be more inclined to fight with her than stand alone against her army. On Tigerstar's side, while the plotting was also important, one of his biggest goals was finally getting to kill Firestar himself, as only Scourge managed that the first time. However, Hawkfrost leads his own ambush patrol and kills the leader first, leaving Tigerstar enraged to be robbed of the one thing he most wanted from this battle. Seeing how he reacted was another tipping point in motivating some cats to go against him. RiverClan's own revolution, as the trainees, under Otterheart's leadership, turned on the Dark Forest residents who wouldn't stand with them was another big factor, as even plenty of the residents agreed to stand with the trainees rather than the elites. I also wanted to ensure for this that, unlike in the original, the Three's powers had an important part to play in the battle's end. While the clans were fighting well, the Dark Forest's army was endless. They couldn't die, and could simply be sent back to fight more each time they got injured, while the Living Clan's warriors would be sent to StarClan and blocked off from returning. The three realized that what is needed to turn the tides is breaking down that barrier, making StarClan and the Dark Forest one body of ancestors as they were in the beginning, and ultimately preventing any of them from coming down physically at all. StarClan, with warriors featured all across the arc as well as those that died in this battle, gets to face off with the Dark Forest residents until Dovewing and Jayfeather manage to convince them that they will change the clans for the better without further bloodshed, and they are allowed to break the barrier. No one's death will ever be met with punishment again, although the ancestors in general will also never get the power back that was spent on breaking their barrier. Finally, after freeing Fallen Leaves from the tunnels so he can rejoin the Ancients, the Three's powers are completely gone, and they return to the clans. There are only two things left to do at this point. First is the 9 Lives ceremony of Brightheart, now Brightstar, and Otterheart of RiverClan. We only get to directly see the former, but they do occur at the same time, and both are advised by all of StarClan to honor the Three's promise and change the clans when they return. For Brightstar's 9 Lives, I was actually left with an abundance of choices when I went to pick some options. I ended up including more cameos who I wanted to say something to her without having a life to offer in order to expand the characters I could bring up. Ultimately, I wanted to include a balance of characters from her older and more recent history, and include some lives with lessons I felt would most benefit her as she becomes ThunderClan's new leader. She also selected Hazeltail as her deputy, a younger warrior to bring in new ideas, but also a level-headed and grounded type who could understand the values of some of the codes they may choose to leave behind. At this point, the clans come together, change the code, and in many ways, reinvent the basic structure of the clans. Among other changes, clan swapping is allowed for anyone at any time after becoming a warrior. All apprentices spend a week in each of the other clans learning their skills before they become a warrior, and messengers have been instated as a permanent role since they were so useful during the final battle. Medicine cats can have kits now, assuming they have another medicine cat in the den capable of taking over while they're nursing, and cross-clan relationships are completely allowed. With all the changes, my hope is that there would be plenty of opportunities to explore more of the different clans in the future, especially with so many cats we know spread out among the clans, and so many new faces in ThunderClan. I would also imagine that not every cat is in favor of the clan changes, and there may well be some backlash in the future, not even mentioning what happens when SkyClan returns, but all of those are possibilities to consider on another day. And we arrive here at the end. First of all, I'd like to answer a common question about where I plan to go from here. I'm not going to jump into another full arc or multi-arc rewrite so soon, and I'd like to take a break from writing to focus on other things in my life. But I may well return someday for shorter one-off stories like Where Are They Now periods or my rewrite of Hollyleaf's story. But for now, I'll leave those as possibilities for the future. From the length of this video, it should be obvious enough that I had a lot I wanted to say about Paws of Stars and the choices going into it. But believe it or not, even in here, I didn't come close to covering every piece of the series. The thoughts I have about various support and background characters and their relationships, more of the specifics to how I fleshed out the Dark Forest, thoughts I have about the future of the clans after this point, and even some plots and character arcs were skipped over to keep the video even this concise. This is actually why I decided to avoid making a video when I first thought of a Power of 3 and Omen of the Stars rewrite. I love the many videos in all sorts of media where people describe the alternative ways that they would change a story in order to improve it based on the flaws of the original. But one of the biggest things that I needed to sell the story I was conceiving was a community of complex characters that you can know, see grow, and care about, so that the conflicts, especially at the end, have any weight. Saying a character's backstory or quickly skipping by the fact that you should learn to care about this character or another isn't nearly as effective as letting a reader organically learn about the characters within a story and develop their own personal feelings, biases, and interests. I absolutely love that some people grew attached to a random background character from the clans or Dark Forest because that was my intention, and it's what I did too. I wanted to make a world full of characters you care about so that when it comes time to save the world, you know that world is worth saving, and that these characters may be capable of doing it. This is why I chose to work for 3.5 years on this monster of a no-profit project, and why I have been so careful about avoiding direct spoilers or even talking directly about what Paws of Stars is and what it contains since I started this channel. I didn't want anything to be told to you that could be learned organically as the story was coming out. I want each of you who may have any interest in this story to experience it for yourself and decide for yourself how you feel about it. All I can say is that, having finally finished it, I am happy with the product. I'm not a perfect writer, but I have created a complete story that I am proud of, with themes that resonate with me and a world full of characters I have come to care about so deeply, even if, within the text, they only spoke a couple times. If you are so inclined, I would encourage you to check out the full series too. Archive of Our Own has a feature where you can download each book to a PDF and make it any font you want, or even put it into a text-to-speech reader so you can listen to it as you go. So I hope as many of you as may want to can access it. And now that it is done, and I feel more comfortable talking openly about it, I do have one other announcement. Next Saturday, after I've given everyone some time to read the story, I will be holding one more livestream where I will answer any Paws of Stars questions you may have. I have a channel in my Discord server where you can submit questions ahead of time if you want, but I will also be taking questions during the livestream itself. This livestream will also be a draw pile, a space where any of you can draw with me on the same canvas over the course of the stream. I'll have the key for that in my Discord server when the day comes, but I have the download information for the draw pile app in the description below right now. If you're interested in coming, I look forward to seeing you next Saturday and answering any questions you may have. For now, though, I think it is time to sign off. Thank you so much for watching, and always remember that if there's something you want to make, do, or become. It's possible, as long as you start and keep going until you are done. You are capable of more than you may ever know.